Larry Hoover Sr. was born November 30, 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi. His family moved north to Chicago when he was a child, part of the larger Great Migration of black families leaving the Jim Crow South for industrial cities in the Midwest. They landed on Chicago's South Side, in neighborhoods that were racially segregated, under-resourced, and heavily policed. Jobs were scarce, schools were struggling, and a lot of young people felt abandoned by the system. Out of that environment, new street cliques and gangs formed, partly for protection, partly for identity, and partly as a response to poverty. By his early teens, Hoover was already drawn into that life. Supreme Gangsters and the birth of the Gangster Disciples. At just 13 years old, Hoover joined a small South Side gang called the Supreme Gangsters, active in the Englewood neighborhood. Over time, Hoover's leadership skills pushed him upward. He was known for organizing, strategizing, and thinking bigger than the average street hustler. Under his influence, the Supreme Gangsters grew. Meanwhile, another powerful group was rising, the Black Disciples, led by David Barksdale. The Supreme Gangsters and Black Disciples were bitter rivals, and their wars contributed to the violence on the South Side. In 1969, Hoover and Barksdale did something rare. They agreed to a truce and merged their organizations. The new combined group was called the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, BGDN, often shortened to Gangster Disciples later on. That merger was a turning point. Instead of being just another small neighborhood gang, the BGDN became a major power in Chicago street life, taking over after David Barksdale's death. In 1974, David Barksdale died from kidney failure, linked to injuries from a 1970 shooting. After his death, Larry Hoover became the main leader of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation and effectively took the chair. Under Hoover's leadership, the organization became more structured, with ranks, rules, and written codes. The BGDN expanded its grip on the South Side drug trade, using violence and intimidation to control territory. By the late 1970s, the Black Gangster Disciples were one of the most powerful and feared street organizations in Chicago. The 1973 murder and 150-200-year sentence Hoover's rise came with serious consequences. In February 1973, a 19-year-old named William Pookie Young was kidnapped and murdered after being accused of stealing drugs or money from the gang. Authorities said Hoover ordered the killing. Hoover was convicted of murder in Illinois State Court and, in 1973, was sentenced to 150-200 years in prison. He was sent first to Stateville Correctional Center and later other Illinois prisons. For most people, that kind of sentence would end any influence they had. For Hoover, it became the start of a new chapter, running an empire from prison. Prison did not stop Hoover's reach. It changed how he operated. While incarcerated, he continued to control and expand the Gangster Disciples, now often called GD for short. Key points about this phase. The organization spread beyond Chicago into dozens of states, especially across the Midwest and the South. It functioned like a corporation, with hierarchy, written memos, and officers handling business in the streets and in other prisons. Federal investigators later said the group made millions of dollars through drug trafficking, extortion, and other crimes, and used violence to enforce control. A 1980s memo from Hoover laid out internal organizational plans, and he reportedly took on titles like chairman of the board, reflecting how corporate the structure had become. In the eyes of law enforcement, Hoover was no longer just a gang leader. He was a kingpin of a multi-state criminal enterprise. Growth and development, and the rebranding. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Hoover began pushing a new public image for his organization. Instead of Gangster Disciples, he promoted the name Growth and Development. Inside prison, the idea, at least outwardly, was to focus on education, politics, and community development, encourage members to pursue self-improvement and leadership, present the group as a social and political movement, not just a gang. Some members and supporters say this was a sincere shift. Hoover was getting older, had spent years in prison, and wanted to reform the organization into something positive. Law enforcement, however, mostly saw growth and development as a front. A rebranding meant to legitimize the gang's influence while the underlying criminal activities continued. Both things can be true at once. He might have been trying to redirect parts of the organization, yet still benefited from its illegal operations. Operation Headache and the 1990s federal case. By the early 1990s, federal authorities had been watching Hoover and the Gangster Disciples for years. They launched a 17-year investigation, including wiretaps and undercover work, aimed at showing Hoover was still running the gang from behind bars. In 1995, a huge coordinated crackdown called Operation Headache led to the arrest of Hoover and 21 other high-ranking members. All that's interesting, in 1997, Hoover was convicted in federal court on 40 counts, including conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, operating a continuing criminal enterprise from prison. He received 6 additional life sentences, on top of his state murder sentence. After that, Hoover was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, one of the most secure prisons in the United States, where inmates are typically locked down about 23 hours a day. Cultural impact and name in hip-hop. Even as he remained locked up, Larry Hoover's name traveled far beyond Chicago. He became a symbol in street culture, especially in cities influenced by the folk nation BGDN network. Rappers referenced him in lyrics as a symbol of power, structure, or outlaw fame. His case became an example in debates about mass incarceration, gang policing, and whether long sentences lead to transformation or just warehousing people. In 2018, rapper Kanye West, Ye, brought Hoover up in an Oval Office meeting with then-President Donald Trump, arguing that Hoover had changed and should be released. In 2021, a benefit concert by Ye and Drake explicitly called attention to Hoover's situation, blending entertainment, activism, and controversy. For some, Hoover is a figure of redemption and reform. For others, he remains the architect of an organization that caused immense harm. Recent developments, commutation and clemency push. A major update in his story came recently. In May 2025, former President Donald Trump commuted Larry Hoover's federal life sentences, effectively removing the federal portion of his punishment. However, Hoover still has to serve his 200-year Illinois state sentence for the 1973 murder of William Pookie Young, so he remains imprisoned. In 2024, during a court hearing, Hoover stated that he had cut ties with the gang, saying, "I am no longer the man I was." In 2025, he formally requested clemency from Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, arguing that he is elderly, has health issues, and wants to spend his remaining years with his family. The governor has not granted that request as of the latest reports. So right now, Hoover is a 74-year-old man who spent more than 5 decades behind bars, still at the center of a debate. Is he a changed elder deserving mercy, or a symbol of violent organized crime whose sentence should stand? Legacy, power, damage, and debate. Larry Hoover's legacy is complicated and controversial. On one hand, he was a central architect of the Gangster Disciples, a group that law enforcement links to decades of drug trafficking, murder, and community harm across the U.S. On the other hand, he tried to pivot the organization toward growth and development, sounding themes of education, politics, and community work, and now publicly says he regrets the violence and wants a different legacy. He's real, not myth. Hip-hop and street legend can make Hoover sound almost fictional, but his story is very concrete. Real people were harmed, real sentences handed down. He shows how gangs scaled up. The Gangster Disciples under Hoover are a case study in how street gangs evolved into structured, multi-state organizations. Redemption versus accountability is ongoing. His later efforts at rebranding and his statements about change raise hard questions. How much transformation is enough? How do you balance mercy with the scale of past harm? Whether someone sees him as a villain, a cautionary tale, a transformed elder, or some mix of all three, Larry Hoover's life is deeply tied to the history of Chicago, the evolution of gangs in America, and the wider conversation around crime, punishment, and reform. 1. What is the Folk Alliance? The Folk Nation, usually just folk or folks, is an alliance of street and prison gangs that started in Chicago and then spread across the U.S., especially the Midwest. It's not one single gang. It's like a family umbrella that a bunch of different gangs fall under and ride with, mainly for backup, identity, and politics, especially in jail prison. They're traditionally opposed to another big alliance, the People Nation. 2. Who started it, where, and when? Founder, generally credited to Larry Hoover, chairman of the Gangster Disciple Nation, BGDN at the time, where, inside Stateville Correctional Center, an Illinois state prison near Chicago, when, around 1978, some sources say April-November 1978, all agree it's late 70s. The story. Hoover sat down with various Chicago gang leaders, black, Latino, and white, inside Stateville, and pushed the idea of a unified alliance so all their people would stand together in prison and on the streets. 3. Why was the folk nation created? Short version: protection, power, and order. More detail: prison politics. In the 70s, prisons were filling up with Chicago gang members from different sets. Hoover saw that if his people stayed divided, they'd be easier targets for rival groups and guards. A big alliance meant numbers and leverage. Unifying gangs under one flag. Instead of each gang doing its own thing, the folk alliance created a sense of we're folks before anything in certain situations. That gave structure to who rides with who when things jump off. Response to enemies, People Nation. Soon after folks formed, rival gangs built the People Nation as the opposite umbrella, vice lords, Latin kings, etc. So it turned into a major folks versus peoples citywide and prison-wide alignment. Street business control. With an alliance, they could coordinate better on drug spots, extortion, and territory, instead of constant free-for-all warfare between every separate gang. 4. What does folk on being folks mean? In that world, folk or folks means you're part of the Folk Nation Alliance, you ride under the 6. The number 6 is a big symbol. Many folks use 6-point star pitchforks. Certain hand signs, numbers, and codes. Symbolically, Folk Nation is often described as the right-hand side, while People Nation is the left-hand side, especially in Chicago gang lit and fashion, tilted hats, flags, etc. It's less about one individual gang and more about which side of the bigger war you're on in Chicago politics. 5. Who is part of the Folk Nation? Different sources list slightly different sets, but common Folk Nation gangs, especially Chicago roots, include major black folk gangs, Gangster Disciples, GD or GDN, Black Disciples, BD. Historically folks, though BD versus GD beef is Big Satan Disciples, Maniac Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, MLD. Major Latino folk gangs, Latin Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, MLD. Spanish Gangster Disciples, Spanish Cobras, Imperial Gangsters, 2-6, 2-6 Boys, Ambrose La Raza, Latin Eagles White, Mixed Folk Gangs, Simon City Royals, Insane Popes, North Side, some other North Side, suburb sets tied in over time. Not every single set is active everywhere, but these are some of the classic Folk Nation players, especially in Chicago and Midwest gang history. 6. Folk versus people, the big picture. To really get it, picture two huge umbrellas. Folk Nation founder, Larry Hoover. Birthplace, Stateville Prison. Symbol, 6. 6-point star, pitchforks. Mixed black, Latino, and some white gangs. Big examples: Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, Satan Disciples, MLDs, Spanish Cobras, Simon City Royals, 2-6, etc. People Nation formed in answer to folk symbol. 5, 5-point star, crowns, etc. Big examples: Vice Lords, Latin Kings, Mickey Cobras, El Ruckins, Black Pea Stones, etc. For decades in Illinois prisons and streets, are you folks or peoples? Was a basic alignment question that could decide whether someone is ally or Alpern 7. One important detail: even though they're under the same alliance, folk gangs can and do beef with each other. For example, GD versus BD. The alliance matters most for big picture politics and prison unity, but on the streets, local block beefs still override that sometimes. Both Gangster Disciples, GD, and Black Disciples, BD, come out of Chicago's South Side trace, back to the old disciple structure from the 1960s, were once together under the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, BGDN, banner. But over time, they split and became separate gangs with their own leadership, identity, and alliances. Origins. Same tree, different branches. Black Disciples, BD, rooted in the disciple sets led by David Barksdale in the 1960s. Barksdale became known as King David, leader of the Black Disciples Nation. The BDs see themselves as following Barksdale's legacy and the original disciple line. Gangster Disciples, GD, tied heavily to Larry Hoover and the Supreme Gangsters, which merged with Barksdale's people. After that merger, you had the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, BGDN. Over time, Hoover's side pushed the gangster identity, which eventually became Gangster Disciples. So at one point, BD plus GD were together as part of a larger umbrella. The split is what creates the difference. The split, the BGDN unity, didn't last. Internal beefs, power struggles, and different visions caused a break. One side leaned more toward the Gangster Disciple identity, Hoover's line. The other side leaned back into the Black Disciple identity, Barksdale's legacy. From there, Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples became separate organizations. In many areas, they've been active rivals, even though they share common roots. Structure identity, Gangster Disciples, GD. Known for being highly structured and organized, especially during Hoover's peak. Big on written literature, rules, codes, and rank structure. Often represented by Star of David, 6-point star, pitchforks colors, often black-blue, under the larger folk nation umbrella in traditional Chicago gang politics. Black Disciples, BD, also structured but with their own internal sets, cliques, and leaders. Heavy presence in specific Southside housing projects and blocks, like O Block and Parkway Gardens in modern times. Often represented by pitchforks facing down, varies by area. Sometimes similar colors, black-blue, but their BD identity, blocks, and dead homies define them more than just color. Traditionally fall under the folk disciple family tree, but BD versus GD beef overrides any old umbrella politics in a lot of spots. Alliances beef. Historically, GD and BD have had some of the most famous internal disciple-on-disciple wars in Chicago. Even though they share ancestry, in many neighborhoods they are straight-up ops. Both have separate leadership. Dead homies they ride for blocks, hoods they claim internal politics. So, same roots, different flag, and in practice often enemies. BGDN, classic nation structure ranks. In the BGDN era, think of it like a pyramid. A, top-level chairman, Hoy King. In practice, this was shared influence between David King David Barksdale, Black Disciples, Larry Hoover, Gangster Disciples, Supreme Gangsters. They were seen as the supreme authority over the nation, setting policy, deciding alliances, truces, and overall direction. Board lashed, Main 21 type concept. Under the top figures, you had a small inner circle of high-ranking leaders, sometimes described as a board, council, or numbered body. This group handled major decisions, discipline issues, high-level disputes, and directives down to the lower ranks. B. National city leadership below the chairman board. BGDN would have governors was coordinators, citywide region, in charge of entire sections of the city, south side, west side, certain suburbs, or entire states once expansion started, responsible for relaying orders from top end, coordinating between different sets under the BGDN flag, collecting dues tax, handling major disputes between different neighborhoods. C. Area where neighborhood leadership. Regents, overseers, area chiefs, names vary by era and source. These would run clusters of sets blocks. Made sure every local set followed nation rules, paid what they owed, and stayed in line with big-picture alliances. D. Local set leadership. At the neighborhood or building level, project, block set, chief, king, coordinator, set leader, highest authority on that block or in that project under the nation flag. Lieutenants help the set leader supervise members, handle discipline, oversee specific corners or crews. Sergeants, enforcers, enforced rules on the ground, dealt with internal violations, sometimes organizing protection and retaliation. Regular members. Full members under oath pledge, expected to follow laws, pay dues, and ride for the set. Shorties, prospects, younger or not fully brought in yet, often used for errands, watching corners, etc. So for BGDN, you can picture chairman, board, governors, area chiefs, set leaders, lieutenants, enforcers, members, shorties, Gangster Disciples, GD, GDN, structure ranks. When Black Disciples and Gangster Disciples split, Hoover's side kept the Gangster Disciple Nation identity and refined its structure, especially from prison. Over time, the GDs became famous for being very structured, almost like a corporation. A Supreme Leadership Chairman of the Board, Sun King, Chairman Hoover, Larry Hoover, is historically referred to as the chairman. From prison, he was said to approve high-level moves, appoint or confirm certain leadership positions, issue memos and policy changes, like the shift to growth development, board of directors, board members. A small number of very high-ranking GDs who managed different regions or operational areas, interpreted and enforced national policies, acted as the top decision-making body under Hoover. This is where the term GDN board comes from in a lot of literature and indictments. B. Governors, coordinators. The next layer down. Nation-state governors. In charge of an entire state or large region. They're the ones who communicate with the board, appoint or approve regents, area leaders, ensure each region pays dues and follows literature, the rules, concepts, codes. Regents are regional coordinators, in charge of clusters of cities or major areas inside a state. They oversee several city coordinators or high-ranking set leaders. See city, neighborhood-level ranks. Within a city, like Chicago, the structure breaks down further. City coordinator, city governor. The top GD in that city or major metro area. Area coordinator, sector chief over a set of neighborhoods, for example, one side of town. Set block chief, head, runs one specific set or block, building, or complex. Lieutenants, assistant chiefs, help manage different crews, shifts, or corners. Sergeants, enforcers, security enforce rules, handle discipline, ensure meetings, sessions are secure, carry out certain orders. D. Regular members, newcomers. Soldiers, members fully recognized GDs, have been taught literature, symbols, codes, shorties, prospects, fraternity level, depending on region. People being tested, trained, or still in the early phase. Associates, hang-arounds, friends, or people who moved near the organization but aren't fully brought in. Growth and development layer. When Hoover pushed the rebrand to growth development, the rank wording sometimes softened, but the core structure stayed similar. Chairman, board, governors, coordinators still existed. On paper, roles were framed more around political education, community service, self-development programs internally, though law enforcement and indictments argue that business as usual continued in many areas, just under a different name. Similarities. Differences in BGDN versus GD ranks. Similarities: both use a pyramid structure. Top leader, central council, regional bosses, area bosses, block bosses, soldiers. Both use rank names borrowed from corporate world, board, chairman, governor, military, lieutenant, sergeant, soldier. Both have written laws and literature, internal court, discipline systems, dues and taxes. Key differences. BGDN was a combined umbrella, BD plus GD plus others. Leadership was more split between Barksdale's and Hoover's sides. When unity collapsed, the internal rank map changed because each side reorganized separately. GDN under Hoover became more centralized, especially from prison. The idea of chairman of the board and a formal board is much more associated with the Gangster Disciples period. The GDs developed a reputation for being one of the most organized and hierarchical Chicago-origin gangs. Important reality check. All of this is simplified because ranks and titles can change by city, time period, and even by who's telling the story. Some eras are more formal, written structure, others more loose and block-based. And in real life, personal reputation, money, and violence often outweigh whatever title someone holds on paper.